Now that idea of a controlling concept can also be used in nonfiction. I showed you or demonstrated how that was used in fiction. I wrote a book about crisis. When our daughter was 8 years old, she had a malignant tumor that destroyed part of her skull. And then 3 years later, she fell and hit the other side of her head against a brick wall and had a closed head concussion while I was writing a book about the first experience. And my son came to me and he said, "Mom, why do you think God is allowing these things to happen, while you're writing a book about crisis?" And I said, "Well, I think maybe it's just on the job training." And he said, "Next time write a book about getting rich." But in that book, I described the second incident where she fell and hit her head against a brick wall and had the closed head concussion. That happened 4 weeks after my mother had a major stroke. And so, here I'm trying to write a book, trying to maintain some vestiges of faith, trying to deal with all these situations. And in the book, I used an image of something that my son told me that happened to him at camp. He was at camp, and they were all playing this little game where girls would kind of stand in a huddle and take the hand of a boy and begin scratching his hand like this, gently, 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 and pretty soon it would have been a big scab because it would have lost sensation. And I compared my controlling concept for that part of the book was that crisis is like that. It feels innocuous, it feels like you can handle it, and pretty soon you become so numb to it and you do not realize that you're being scraped away. Does that sound familiar to you in leaving Mormonism? I think that's an image that you can probably identify with. But that sort of image speaks to people because it takes an experience that people can see or visualize, and then they can say, I know how that feels, even though nobody ever scratched my hand that way. Another thing you need to do when you're going to write is look around and think to yourself, what kind of writing speaks to you? What has been effective in your life? And I brought along, this is also something I've never done in public. When I started writing Latter-day Cipher, after I took the class in novel writing, and after I put myself through a course called the Marshall Plan for Novel Writing, which is a paperback book with a workbook. I was serious about doing this right. The book Silence of the Lambs is not one of my favorite books, but is one of the most well-written suspense books ever written. And I took it apart because I wanted to know what made it effective with points of view. Here in the back, I took each chapter and charted out from whose point of view it was being written. Now, I don't say you have to do that. What I'm telling you is, what kind of writing do you think is effective? What kind of writing would you like to do, not imitate, but emulate, so that you can be effective? Take it apart. Find out what made it effective. What made Thomas Harris's book effective was his plotting, and I took it apart to see the pacing of his plotting and the changes of point of view, and I think it helped me. So I brought that along to show you to do that. Another thing that is very, very effective, and I guess we're all, if you've read any of Dan Brown's books, he's really good at doing this, and that is to tease the reader. And by tease them, I mean get them interested in something so that they go along with you. The first inkling I ever had that I could write a novel, or my first desire to ever write a novel, was about 20 years ago, and I was reading a Mary Higgins Clark book. Any of you guys read Mary Higgins Clark? Let me read you this paragraph, and I read this in the car with my husband. I laid the book down and I said, you know what, if I could write like that, if I could ever achieve that kind of compelling, drawing a reader in, I want to write a novel. Listen to this and see if you don't agree with me. If her mind had not been on the case she won, Katie might not have taken the curve so fast, but the inner satisfaction of the guilty verdict was still absorbing her. It had been a close one. Roy O'Connor was one of the top defense attorneys in New Jersey. The defendant's confession had been suppressed by the court, a major blow for the prosecution. But still she'd managed to convince the jury that Teddy Copeland was the man who had viciously murdered 8-year-old Abigail Rawlings during a robbery. Miss Rawlings' sister, Margaret, was in court to hear the verdict and afterward had come up to Katie. You were wonderful, Miss DeMeo, she said. You look like a young college girl. What are you doing through this? You're saying, what about the curve? Why did she take the curve so fast? In the first sentence, she has told you that this woman is about to take a curve too fast, and then she spends the next 3 or 4 pages telling you about the court case. And you want to, well, I wanted to, not strangle her, but I wanted her to get to the point. Now, with reading a book, you can read ahead and that sort of thing, but it's very satisfying to a reader to have someone throw something out that compels their interest and then string you along for a while. It's not fraudulent to do that. It's actually very satisfying. Another thing that is very, very effective that a beginning writer can do, and that is to choose a phrase and either repeat the phrase or to do variations on the phrase. And I'm not going to read it because I think we're going to run out of time. But in the Mormon Mirage, well, let me back up. This book was first published in 1979. And then I was asked to rewrite it and update it, which I thought, oh, well, I can just bring all the footnotes up to date and, you know, a few changes in Mormon doctrine, and it will only take me 5 years, which it did. But I thought I could do it, you know, in a series of months. But in the last chapter, I used the phrase, I was there and I believed. And I build tension with that phrase by saying, well, by starting in the last chapter with talking about meeting a young girl whose house parents at the Christian Children's Home there had asked me to speak to her. She was a Mormon. She had been raised as a foster child in a Mormon home and had been abused while she was there. And this girl was half Oriental and half Caucasian. And I told her as we were sitting down, I said, you know, I left the Mormon church when I was not too much older than you are, so I can kind of identify with that. But I said, you know, the Mormon church has changed so much. She said, well, what do you mean? And I said, well, you know, the changes in the blacks holding the priesthood, you know, the changes in the Book of Mormon. And she said, wait a minute, what do you mean blacks holding the priesthood? I said, well, you know, for many, many years, blacks were not able to hold a priesthood in the Mormon church. I said, you grew up in the Mormon church. She said, I never heard that. And I said to her, I was there. I believed. And I had major problems when changes like that happened. Well, I use that phrase, and so I'm urging you to consider a technique of using as your controlling concept a phrase. The image in the end of this is the Hosanna shout. Have any of you ever participated in Hosanna shout? That's where you wave a white handkerchief in solemn assembly and shout Hosanna. Is it at the dedication of a temple? I think that's when I did that, yeah. And I use the imagery of the Hosanna shout now as a believer in Jesus Christ and not a believer in Mormonism, what that meant to me. Another thing that if you're going to write anything that's nonfiction or if you write fiction is to organize your thoughts. I've alluded to these 3x5 cards. Let me tell you how I write an article or a book of nonfiction. I start taking notes on 3x5 cards. Each source that I use, I assign a number. And this is a Reader's Digest condensed version of how to do this. But say this would be source number 1, so I don't have to write it out every time I allude to it on my cards. This is source number 2, and I keep a set of source cards in these. Then when I get ready to write an article or a book, I clear out an area in my house, sit down in the middle of the floor, and deal cards. And I let the book find the form of my material. And it's a very natural way to write. You can do that because when you start writing something, things will be in clumps. There'll be, you know, different areas of things. You deal them out into the major clumps. Say there's 3 major areas of what you're going to be talking about or writing about. After you've got them in their 3 clumps, go through the clumps and make sure what's in each clump deserves to be in that pile. And then put 2 of them aside and do the same thing until you've gotten your material organized. I wrote the entire Mormon Mirage in longhand in spiral notebooks, a pile of spiral notebooks off of 3x5 cards. And nobody's ever accused me of being disorganized in this book. They've accused me of other things, but not that. That's just a freebie. The other thing, and Sue alluded to this, in writer's circles we have an acronym, BIC. Does anybody know what that stands for? Butt in chair. Everybody thinks that writing is done, you know, as you're walking through the woods and you're having inspiration and you know, things are coming to you and you're watching movies or books, but the real writing doesn't happen until you sit down in a chair and put your fingers on a keyboard or on a pencil and make it happen. Now you think, well, I know that. I am a professional writer. I've been writing and publishing for 35 years. Do you know what an enormous erosive effect the internet has had on my writing production?